You think you know cold? You think your morning commute in winter traffic is suffering? Tonight, while you're adjusting your thermostat and complaining about heating bills, I'm going to take you somewhere that will freeze the smugness right out of your comfortable ignorance. A place where winter wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence with a calendar. Welcome to medieval Scandinavia, where surviving winter meant dancing with demons you can't even imagine. Picture this. It's November in a Norse village, somewhere in what you now call Sweden. The year? Let's say 1347, the same year the Black Death started its continental tour, but that's another nightmare for another night. Right now, we're dealing with something more immediate, more visceral, more personal. You see, when historians talk about medieval winters, they use words like harsh and challenging. They don't tell you about the sounds. The sounds are what haunt me most. Close your eyes and listen. Can you hear it? That wet, tearing noise echoing through the frost-covered walls of a longhouse? That's not firewood being split. That's Olaf the blacksmith removing his own frostbitten fingers with a rusty blade, piece by piece, joint by joint. Because gangrene doesn't wait for spring, and neither does survival. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with something simpler, something your modern mind can grasp before I drag you deeper into this frozen hell. Food. You love food, don't you? You probably had 3 meals today, maybe a snack. You opened a refrigerator, heated something in a microwave, ordered delivery with an app. How wonderfully civilized. How beautifully naive. In our Norse village, food in winter isn't about choice. It's about calculation. It's about measuring the weight of your children against the weight of your livestock and making decisions that would shatter your modern moral compass into 1,000 bloody fragments. Every calorie becomes a negotiation with death itself. The autumn harvest determined everything. If the grain yield was poor, if the fish runs were thin, if the hunt brought back insufficient meat, well, then you entered what they called the choosing time. Don't let the poetic name fool you. The choosing time wasn't about preference. It was about who lives and who becomes fertilizer for next spring's crops. Here's something they don't teach in your comfortable history classes. Cannibalism wasn't taboo in Norse culture when survival demanded it. It was practical. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lund and Sigtuna shows cut marks on human bones consistent with butchering practices. But we don't talk about that, do we? We prefer our Vikings with horned helmets and noble deaths in battle. The truth is far less romantic and infinitely more disturbing. Let me paint you a picture that will stick to your conscience like frost to flesh. It's January. The stored grain ran out 3 weeks ago. The preserved meat is nothing but a memory. The last of the fish went to the children yesterday. You're standing in your longhouse, looking at your neighbor's daughter, little Astrid, and your stomach is eating itself from the inside. She's weak from hunger, barely moving, and you realize she won't make it to spring anyway. This is where your modern sensibilities would crumble, isn't it? This is where you tell yourself that surely there was another way, but there wasn't. The mathematics of medieval winter were brutal and exact. X amount of food divided by Y number of mouths equals Z chance of survival. If the equation doesn't balance, people die. The only variable you could control was which people. The weak went first. Not because the Norse were heartless, but because sentiment is a luxury the living can't afford when death is knocking at your door with icicle fingers. The elderly, the sick, the very young, they became what euphemistic historical records call winter casualties. But that's not what they were, is it? They were sacrifices. Conscious, calculated sacrifices made by people who understood that sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes letting go means picking up a knife. Women faced a particularly horrific calculation. Pregnancy during winter was essentially a death sentence for both mother and child. The additional caloric requirements couldn't be met, and childbirth in freezing conditions with no medical knowledge. Archaeological remains show evidence of desperate measures, crude surgical tools, makeshift abortifacients made from toxic plants, bodies of infants buried in concealment, away from community burial grounds. The silence of these graves speaks volumes about decisions that left scars on souls that never healed. But let's talk about something even more disturbing, something that makes your comfortable assumptions about human nature crumble like ice under pressure. The lottery. Yes, they had lotteries. Not for prizes, you understand. For death. When food ran critically low and the choosing time arrived, some communities would draw lots to determine who would walk into the snow. A voluntary death sentence disguised as fairness. The ritual was simple. Carved bone pieces, each marked differently, placed in a leather pouch. The selected individual would dress in their finest clothes, bid farewell to their family, and walk out into the blizzard. They called it going to meet the ancestors. Oh, and historical sagas record these events with disturbing matter-of-factness, describing final meals, final embraces, final words spoken with frost already forming on lips that would never speak again. And here's the part that should terrify you most. They often went willingly, not because they wanted to die, but because they understood the mathematics of survival better than your sheltered modern mind ever could. They knew that their death might mean their children lived. Their sacrifice might tip the scales just enough to carry their bloodline through to spring. This wasn't despair. This was love expressed through the most brutal calculus imaginable. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors often reported what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Rune stones from the period contained cryptic references to winter madness and frost dreams. These weren't poetic metaphors. They were clinical descriptions of people driven insane by the weight of the choices they'd made, by the faces that haunted their dreams, by the taste of things they'd eaten that should never have been consumed. Temperature records reconstructed from ice cores and tree rings tell us that medieval winters were significantly harsher than anything you've experienced. We're talking about temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees C for weeks at a time. In wooden structures with primitive heating, wearing clothes made from animal skins and rough woven wool, your breath would freeze, your saliva would freeze, the inside of your nose would freeze. And those were the lucky ones who had shelter. The unlucky ones, the ones who lost their homes to fire or couldn't afford the communal longhouse fees, or were cast out for crimes or debts, they became what the Norse called ice walkers. Living humans who haunted the edges of settlements like ghosts, slowly freezing to death, occasionally found in spring as perfectly preserved corpses, their faces locked in expressions of agony that time couldn't erase. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. What should keep you awake too? We haven't changed. Not really. Strip away your heating systems, your grocery stores, your emergency services, your social safety nets. Put you in that longhouse in 1347. Give you those same impossible choices. And you'd make the same decisions. You'd draw the same lots. You'd sharpen the same knives. You'd walk into the same snow. Because survival doesn't care about your moral compass. It doesn't care about your modern sensibilities or your humanitarian ideals. When winter comes knocking with its ice-cold fingers, when death starts taking inventory of your supplies and finding them wanting, you discover who you really are. And that discovery, that's the most terrifying thing of all. But this story, it's just beginning. We've barely scratched the surface of what these people endured, what they did to each other, what they became in order to survive. Next time, when you're safely tucked in your climate-controlled environment, I'll tell you about the things they did to keep warm. The desperate measures, the unholy alliances, the bargains they made with forces that should never be awakened. And you'll realize that sometimes freezing to death was the merciful option. You're back. Good. I was wondering if you'd have the stomach to continue after what I showed you. But you're here, aren't you? Drawn back like a moth to a flame that burns with the cold light of truth. Tonight, we're going deeper into the frozen abyss. We're going to talk about heat, about the lengths human beings will go to generate warmth when the alternative is becoming a corpse that won't thaw until spring. You flip a switch, and your house fills with warmth. You turn a knob, and hot water flows from your faucets. You press a button, and your car heats up before you even step outside. Comfort is so effortless for you that you've forgotten it's a miracle. But in our Norse village, heat wasn't a utility. It was a war fought with weapons that would make your civilized mind recoil in horror. Let me start with something simple. Fire. You think you understand fire, don't you? You've roasted marshmallows, lit candles, maybe even built a campfire. How quaint. How utterly innocent. In medieval Scandinavia, fire wasn't romantic. It was the difference between life and death, and maintaining it required sacrifices that would haunt your dreams. The central hearth in a longhouse wasn't just a heating system. It was an altar where they burned everything that could possibly generate heat. Wood, yes, when they could find it. But wood was precious beyond your modern comprehension. Trees were scarce in many regions, and cutting them required energy that starving people couldn't spare. So they burned other things. Dried animal dung mixed with straw, human waste when it was dry enough, old clothing that couldn't keep anyone warm anymore. And when those ran out, when the fuel crisis reached its peak and the fire was dying and the temperature outside was dropping to levels that would kill you in hours, that's when they started burning the bones of their dead. Yes, you heard me correctly. Archaeological excavations at sites like Burka and Hedeby have uncovered hearths containing human bone fragments, showing clear evidence of intentional burning. Skulls cracked open to access the marrow. Femurs split lengthwise to extract every calorie of fat. The ancestors weren't just remembered in these longhouses. They were consumed, transformed into heat. Their very essence turned into the warmth needed to keep their descendants alive another day. But bone burns poorly, and the heat it provides is temporary. What do you do when you've burned your furniture, your waste, your dead, and the cold is still seeping through every crack in the walls like a living thing trying to devour you? You start making deals with the living, deals that transform human beings into fuel for survival. The huddle was both salvation and damnation. When temperatures dropped to fatal levels, survival meant sharing body heat with as many people as possible. But this wasn't the innocent group warmth you might imagine. This was a desperate, sweating, suffocating mass of humanity pressed together so tightly that individual identity dissolved into a collective organism focused solely on generating heat. Privacy didn't exist. Dignity didn't exist. Personal space was a luxury that could kill you. Men, women, children, elderly, strangers, enemies. Everyone pressed together in a writhing pile of flesh, breathing into each other's mouths, feeling each other's hearts beating against their ribs, sharing the most intimate warmth in the most impersonal way imaginable. The smell alone would make you vomit. Unwashed bodies, infected wounds, rotting teeth, human waste, all of it concentrated in a space barely large enough to contain the mass of desperate humanity. And here's where it gets truly disturbing. In these huddles, people died. Heart failure from the exertion, suffocation from the pressure, simply giving up and letting their life force drain away into the collective warmth. But the dead couldn't be removed immediately. Removing a body meant exposing the huddle to cold air, losing precious heat, potentially killing others. So the living continued to huddle with the dead, using corpses as insulation, feeling the gradual cooling of flesh that had once generated warmth. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors described nightmares of being trapped in an endless mass of bodies, unable to distinguish between the living and the dead, unable to escape, unable to breathe, unable to die. Some never recovered. Spring would come, the threat would pass, but they would continue to huddle with anyone they could find, unable to break the psychological conditioning that equated solitude with death. But individual survival was only one aspect of the heat war. Communities developed collective strategies that reveal the truly disturbing depths of human adaptation. The rotation system, for instance. Since maintaining a fire required constant tension and fresh fuel, communities would designate firekeepers. These weren't volunteers, they were conscripts. Usually the weakest members of the community, the ones whose individual survival was least assured anyway. The firekeeper's job was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. Stay awake, keep the fire burning, feed it constantly, never let it die. The penalty for failure wasn't exile or punishment. It was the death of everyone. The weight of collective survival rested on the shoulders of people who were already dying from malnutrition and cold. Archaeological evidence suggests that many firekeepers died at their posts. Their bodies have been found in positions suggesting they froze while still tending the fire. Their hands literally froze into the tools they used to maintain the flames. They died so others could live, but their deaths often meant the fire died with them, dooming the entire community to follow them into the frozen darkness. The truly chilling part is how communities prepared for this possibility. They developed contingency plans that reveal a level of cold calculation that should terrify you. When a firekeeper showed signs of failing, they would be replaced. Not relieved of duty, replaced. The failing keeper would be moved away from the fire and left to die, while a new conscript took their position. Efficiency demanded it, survival required it. Humanity had become a luxury they couldn't afford. Some communities developed even more disturbing practices. The heat lottery I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just about who died. It was about who became fuel. The selected individual wouldn't just walk into the snow. They would be killed inside the longhouse, their body fat rendered into oil for lamps, their meat preserved for emergency food, their bones prepared for eventual burning. Nothing was wasted. Everything was fuel. The process was ritualized to make it bearable for the survivors. Ceremonies that transformed murder into sacrifice, cannibalism into communion, desperation into religious duty. Runestones from the period contain references to feeding the flame with the willing gift and nourishing the warmth with the sacred offering. These weren't metaphors. They were euphemisms for practices so disturbing that even the people performing them couldn't name them directly. And then there were the children. God, the children. You have children, don't you? Or you've been around them. You've seen their innocence, their trust, their absolute dependence on adults to protect them. In the Norse winter, children became currency in the heat economy. Small bodies generated less individual warmth but consumed fewer resources. They could be used as living hot water bottles, pressed against the bodies of adults to warm specific areas. They could be placed inside animal carcasses while the adults skinned them, using their body heat to keep the meat from freezing during butchering. But when resources became critical, when the mathematics of survival reached its most brutal calculations, children became fuel just like everything else. Their smaller bodies burned longer than adult bones. Their fat content was higher, providing more oil for lamps. Their deaths were quicker, less traumatic for the community. Historical records from the period show a disturbing correlation between harsh winters and child mortality rates that far exceed what disease or malnutrition alone could account for. The saddest part isn't the deaths themselves, it's the adaptation. Archaeological excavations have uncovered children's toys made from human finger bones, games that involved trading pieces of dried human flesh like currency, dolls stuffed with human hair and scraps of skin, children who had been conditioned to see human remains not as horrific reminders of death, but as normal components of survival. And these weren't monsters. These were human beings pushed beyond the limits of what human beings should have to endure. They loved their children. They mourned their dead. They celebrated life when they could. But they lived in a world where love meant making choices that would destroy your soul to save your body. Where mourning was a luxury that could kill you if you spent too much energy on it. Where celebration was reserved for the simple miracle of seeing another sunrise. And the most terrifying realization? This isn't ancient history. This is human nature stripped of the comfortable illusions that modern technology provides. Remove your heating systems, your abundant food, your social safety nets, and you become them. You make their choices. You develop their strategies. You transform yourself into whatever survival demands, no matter how monstrous that transformation might be. Climate records show that we're entering a period of increasing weather instability. Your comfortable assumptions about reliable infrastructure are built on foundations far more fragile than you realize. When the systems fail, when the power goes out, when the supply chains break down, you'll remember these stories. You'll understand why I'm telling them to you now, while you still have time to prepare, or to at least understand what you're becoming. But we're not done yet. The heat war was only one battlefield in the larger conflict of winter survival. Next time, I'll tell you about the other wars they fought. The war for space, the war for sanity, the war for something resembling human dignity. And you'll learn why those who survived the winter often wished they hadn't. You're still here. Still listening? I can almost hear your breathing getting shallower as the weight of these truths settles into your bones like winter cold. But you haven't turned away yet, have you? You can't. Because somewhere in your comfortable modern soul, you recognize the terrible familiarity of what I'm showing you. The capacity for these choices lives in you, too. Dormant, but present, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken it. Tonight, we're going to talk about space, about territory, about the wars fought not with swords or axes, but with elbows and fingernails and teeth. Wars fought over inches of floor space, over positions near the fire, over the right to sleep lying down instead of standing up. Wars that transformed humans into animals, and then into something worse than animals. You live in a world of personal space. You have rooms, doors that close, walls that belong to you. Even when you feel crowded, even when you complain about your cramped apartment or your small office cubicle, you have no concept of what real space scarcity means. Let me fix that ignorance for you. A typical Norse longhouse measured roughly 100 feet by 20 feet. Sounds spacious, doesn't it? Until you realize that this single structure housed anywhere from 50 to 100 people during winter months. Not just the core family. Everyone who couldn't afford their own shelter, everyone who owed debts or allegiance, everyone whose own dwelling had burned down or collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. Do the mathematics. 2,000 square feet divided by 75 people equals less than 27 square feet per person. That's smaller than your bathroom. Now imagine living in your bathroom for 6 months with 74 strangers, eating in your bathroom, sleeping in your bathroom, defecating in your bathroom, giving birth in your bathroom, dying in your bathroom, all while the temperature outside hovers around 30 degrees back and the walls leak cold air through every crack and crevice. But even that 27 square feet wasn't equally distributed. Space in a longhouse operated on a rigid hierarchy that determined not just comfort, but survival probability. The area closest to the central fire was reserved for the most important members of the community. The Jarl, his family, his most trusted warriors. They slept on raised platforms covered with the best furs, positioned to receive maximum heat with minimum exposure to smoke. Moving outward from the fire, the space became progressively less desirable and more dangerous. The middle areas housed craftsmen, traders, free farmers. They slept on the floor but had access to shared blankets and could position themselves within the heat zone during the coldest parts of the night. The outer edges, near the walls where ice would form on the inside surfaces, were reserved for the expendable. Slaves, debtors, the elderly, the sick, unmarried women past childbearing age. They slept pressed against walls that leaked cold like open wounds, wrapped in rags, fighting for scraps of warmth that drifted out from the center of the longhouse. This wasn't just social stratification. This was a life and death geography, where your position determined whether you'd see spring. Archaeological excavations show that most bodies found in longhouse ruins cluster near the outer walls, their remains showing signs of prolonged cold exposure and malnutrition. They died in their designated spaces, too weak to fight their way closer to the fire, too unimportant for anyone to share warmth with them. The competition for space was constant and brutal. Position wasn't static. People died, creating opportunities. People fell from favor, losing their privileged spots. New arrivals meant everyone had to squeeze closer together, intensifying the competition, and the methods used to secure and defend territory would make your modern sensibilities crumble like frost. Violence was common, but had to be carefully managed. Injuring someone who might contribute to winter survival was wasteful. Killing someone meant losing their body heat contribution to the collective huddle. So the space wars were fought with psychological weapons that were often more devastating than physical ones. Sleep deprivation was a favorite tactic. Inhabitants would take shifts keeping rivals awake, prodding them, whispering threats, making subtle noises that prevented rest. A person too exhausted to defend their position could be gradually pushed toward the colder areas of the longhouse. Archaeological evidence shows elevated rates of stress fractures and other injuries consistent with chronic sleep deprivation among longhouse inhabitants. Contamination warfare was even more insidious. Deliberately soiling an area with human waste, vomit, or infected wound drainage would make it uninhabitable, forcing the occupant to relocate. The perpetrator could then claim the space while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Historical records describe disputes over fouled sleeping areas that escalated into blood feuds lasting generations. But the most devastating weapon in the space wars was social isolation. In an environment where cooperation meant survival, being excluded from the collective warmth was essentially a death sentence. Rumors, accusations, whispered campaigns of character assassination, these could gradually turn the entire community against an individual, forcing them into the deadly outer zones of the Longhouse. Women faced additional horrors in these space wars. Sexual assault wasn't just a crime of violence, it was a territorial tactic. Raping a woman claimed her space for the attacker, while simultaneously marking her as contaminated in the eyes of the community. Archaeological remains show evidence of healed pelvic fractures and other injuries consistent with repeated sexual violence among female skeletons found in Longhouse excavations. Pregnancy became a space negotiation tool. A pregnant woman needed extra warmth and nutrition, making her a liability in the resource calculations, but she also carried potential new labor for the community, making her valuable in the long term. The result was a horrific form of reproductive politics, where women would sometimes deliberately seek pregnancy from powerful men to secure better positioning, or would attempt to hide pregnancies to avoid being moved to less favorable areas. Children became pawns in adult territorial disputes. Small enough to fit into cramped spaces, but large enough to hold position against other claimants, they could be used to occupy and defend territory for their parents. Archaeological evidence shows signs of rickets and other developmental disorders, consistent with children forced to remain in specific positions for extended periods, their bodies deforming to match the spaces they were required to defend. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Anthropological studies of modern societies living in similar confined conditions show elevated rates of anxiety disorders, paranoid delusions, and violent psychotic episodes. Historical accounts from Norse sagas describe winter madness, a specific form of insanity that struck Longhouse inhabitants, characterized by obsessive territorial behavior, inability to sleep outside their claimed space, and violent reactions to any perceived encroachment. Some individuals developed what we would now recognize as severe agoraphobia. After months of defending small spaces against constant intrusion, they became psychologically incapable of venturing into open areas. Spring would arrive, the Longhouse would empty, but these broken survivors would remain huddled in their tiny claimed territories, unable to reclaim their humanity even when space was no longer scarce. The spatial hierarchy also determined access to other resources. Position near the fire meant access to cooking areas, food preparation, and warmth for drying clothes. But it also meant exposure to smoke, cooking accidents, and the attention of anyone seeking to challenge your position. Many inhabitants developed what historical records describe as fire sickness, respiratory problems from prolonged smoke exposure, but couldn't risk moving away from the heat source. Toilet facilities were another battlefield. The Longhouse had designated waste areas, but access to them required traversing the territory of other inhabitants. Those in peripheral positions often found themselves effectively trapped, unable to reach waste disposal areas without trespassing through hostile territory. Archaeological evidence shows elevated rates of parasitic infections and disease consistent with poor sanitation practices among Longhouse communities. Death created the most intense territorial competitions. When someone died, their space became available, but claiming it required speed, strength, and political maneuvering. Historical accounts describe fights breaking out over corpses that were still warm, with survivors literally pulling bodies out of desirable positions to claim their territory. The dead couldn't be immediately removed in winter conditions, so new occupants would often sleep next to corpses for days or weeks while establishing their claim to the space. But here's the most disturbing part. The spatial hierarchy wasn't just about physical comfort, it was about psychological domination. Those in the center of the Longhouse could literally look down on those relegated to the outer edges. They could observe the suffering of the less fortunate while remaining safely warm themselves. This created a psychological dynamic of superiority and inferiority that often persisted long after winter ended. Some survivors never recovered from their spatial trauma. Spring would come, resources would become available, but they would continue to hoard small spaces, unable to trust that they wouldn't be forced back into the deadly competition for territory. Archaeological evidence shows that many post-winter communities built excessive numbers of small individual structures, as if the survivors were trying to ensure they would never again be forced to share space with others. And the children? The children who grew up in these conditions developed permanently altered concepts of personal space and human relationships. Archaeological excavations have uncovered children's remains, showing bone deformations consistent with spending months in cramped positions, their skeletons literally shaped by the spatial wars they were born into. These weren't temporary adaptations to difficult circumstances. These were permanent transformations of human behavior and psychology. The space wars changed these people at the cellular level, creating trauma responses that were passed down through generations. Modern Scandinavian cultural emphasis on personal space, privacy, and individual territory isn't just cultural preference, it's evolutionary response to generational trauma. But even the space wars weren't the end of winter's horrors. There was another war still to be fought, one that makes territorial disputes look like children's games. Next time, I'll tell you about the war for sanity itself, the battle against the darkness that lived not just outside the Longhouse, but inside the human mind, and you'll understand why madness wasn't a symptom of winter survival. It was a strategy. You're beginning to understand, aren't you? I can feel it in the way you're reading these words, the way your comfortable assumptions about human nature are cracking like ice under pressure, but we're not done breaking you yet. Tonight, we're going to explore the darkest battlefield of all. Not the war for food, or heat, or space. Tonight, we're going to talk about the war for your mind. You think you know darkness. You've experienced power outages, maybe gone camping without streetlights. You've felt the mild discomfort of a long winter night, counting the hours until sunrise. How sweetly naive. In medieval Scandinavia, darkness wasn't an inconvenience. It was a living entity that crawled inside your skull and rewrote the fundamental code of your humanity. Picture this. It's December 21st, the winter solstice. In a village, somewhere around the 65th parallel. The sun, if you can call that pale, dying light a sun, rises at 11 a.m. and sets at 1 p.m. 2 hours of twilight masquerading as daylight. 22 hours of darkness so complete, so absolute, that it has weight. It presses down on you like a burial shroud, seeping through your eyes, your mouth, your pores, until darkness isn't something around you. It's something inside you. But the darkness I'm talking about goes deeper than mere absence of light. Archaeological excavations of Longhouse sites show evidence of what modern psychiatrists would recognize as mass psychotic episodes. Scratch marks carved into wooden posts, not by tools, but by human fingernails. Repetitive patterns gouged into walls by people who had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. Symbols that make no sense, words and languages that never existed, drawings of things that shouldn't be possible. The Norse had a word for it, utigengni. Literally translated, it means going outside, but it didn't refer to physical movement. It meant going outside your own mind. It meant becoming something that was no longer entirely human. And in the crushing darkness of an Arctic winter, utigengni wasn't a rare mental illness. It was as common as frostbite, and infinitely more dangerous. Sleep became the enemy. In normal circumstances, sleep provides escape, rest, recovery. But in the Longhouse, sleep was when the real horror began. When you closed your eyes in that suffocating darkness, surrounded by the breathing, groaning, whimpering mass of desperate humanity, your mind would begin to fracture. The boundary between sleeping and waking would dissolve. You'd find yourself having conversations with people who weren't there, or worse, with people who were there but had been dead for weeks. Historical accounts describe dreamwalking, a condition where individuals would move through the Longhouse while asleep, interacting with their environment, having complex conversations, performing tasks, all while completely unconscious. But they weren't sleepwalking in the benign way you might imagine. They were acting out elaborate fantasies, often violent ones, sometimes sexual ones, frequently involving people and situations that existed only in their fracturing minds. The truly terrifying part was that other inhabitants couldn't always tell who was dreamwalking and who was awake. In the darkness, with everyone pressed together, with the constant background noise of human suffering, reality became negotiable. You might spend hours having what you thought was a normal conversation with someone, only to discover in the dim morning light that you'd been talking to a corpse, or to someone who had been unconscious the entire time, or to no one at all. Hallucinations were universal, not occasional, not rare psychological breaks, universal. Archaeological evidence shows elevated levels of ergot alkaloids in grain samples from Longhouse sites. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, contains compounds similar to LSD. When food supplies were limited and quality control was non-existent, entire communities would consume ergot-contaminated grain, triggering mass hallucinogenic experiences that lasted for days or weeks. But even without chemical triggers, the combination of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide poisoning from poor ventilation, and sensory deprivation created perfect conditions for psychotic breaks. The human brain, starved of stimulation and resources, began creating its own reality. And in the suffocating darkness of a Norse winter, that reality was invariably horrifying. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their developing minds couldn't distinguish between the hallucinations and reality. Archaeological excavations have uncovered children's remains showing evidence of self-inflicted injuries consistent with attempts to escape from things that existed only in their minds. Scratches around the eyes from trying to claw out visions, bite marks on their own arms from trying to wake themselves from walking nightmares, broken bones from throwing themselves against walls to escape invisible pursuers. The adults weren't much better. Historical sagas describe warriors who would suddenly begin fighting invisible enemies, swinging weapons at empty air while their comrades watched in horror. Women who would carry on elaborate conversations with children who had died years earlier. Elderly people who would insist that the walls of the Longhouse were moving, breathing, closing in to crush everyone inside. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The community learned to weaponize madness. If someone was becoming a threat, consuming too many resources, occupying too valuable a position, it was remarkably easy to push them over the edge into complete psychological breakdown. A few whispered suggestions during their vulnerable moments, strategic placement of objects that would trigger their specific hallucinations, social isolation that would amplify their paranoid delusions. The process was called gifting the darkness. You would gradually feed someone's madness until they became completely disconnected from reality, and then you would use their condition to justify taking whatever resources they controlled. Their food rations, their sleeping space, their possessions, all transferred to more stable members of the community, while the victim ranted and raved about threats that existed only in their broken mind. Some communities developed elaborate systems for managing the insane, designated watchers who would monitor the mentally ill, not to help them, but to ensure they didn't become dangerous to the group. These watchers had the authority to restrain, relocate, or even eliminate individuals whose madness threatened community survival. Archaeological evidence shows human remains with rope marks around wrists and ankles, suggesting prolonged restraint, and skulls with fracture patterns consistent with intentional killing. The sexual dynamics of madness were particularly horrific. In a population where normal social boundaries had already collapsed, mental illness removed the last vestiges of sexual consent and protection. Archaeological remains show evidence of sexual violence against individuals with obvious mental disabilities, broken pelvic bones, evidence of repeated trauma, signs of restraint during assault. The mad were seen as less than human, and therefore available for any use the community deemed necessary. But the most disturbing aspect of the madness epidemic wasn't the violence or the exploitation. It was the adaptation. Over time, communities learned to function with a significant percentage of their population in various states of mental illness. They developed social structures that accommodated hallucinations, delusions, and psychotic episodes as normal parts of winter life. Children grew up thinking that adults regularly talked to invisible people, fought invisible enemies, and reacted to threats that didn't exist. They learned to navigate conversations with individuals who were only partially connected to reality. They developed the ability to distinguish between useful madness that might provide labor or entertainment and dangerous madness that required elimination. Some forms of madness were even celebrated. Individuals who claimed to receive visions from the gods, who spoke in prophecies, who demonstrated supernatural knowledge, they were elevated to positions of religious authority. Their hallucinations became the foundation for community decision-making. Their delusions shaped survival strategies. Their madness became a resource more valuable than food or heat. Archaeological evidence shows that many longhouse communities developed elaborate ritual spaces dedicated to managing and channeling mental illness, carved symbols designed to focus hallucinatory experiences, restraint systems that allowed the mad to contribute labor while preventing them from causing harm, performance areas where the insane would act out their delusions for the entertainment and instruction of the community. The psychological conditioning was permanent. Spring would arrive, the darkness would recede, food would become available, but the mental damage was irreversible. Survivors would carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. They would see things that weren't there, hear voices of the dead, react to threats that existed only in their memories of winter madness. More disturbing still, they would seek out these experiences. Having spent months in altered states of consciousness, normal reality felt flat, colorless, insufficient. Many survivors would deliberately induce hallucinations through fasting, sleep deprivation, or consumption of psychoactive substances. They had become addicted to madness, dependent on psychological states that would have horrified their pre-winter selves. The children who survived these winters grew up to be adults who considered madness normal. They built societies that institutionalized mental illness, that created religious and cultural systems designed to manage populations where significant percentages were not entirely sane. Archaeological evidence suggests that this pattern repeated for generations, creating bloodlines where psychological instability was not a disorder, but an adaptation. And here's the truth that should terrify you most. This isn't ancient history. Modern studies of seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, and isolation psychosis show that your comfortable, well-fed, well-heated modern mind is just as vulnerable to these breaks from reality. Remove your antidepressants, your social connections, your entertainment systems, your artificial lighting, and you become them. Your sanity isn't a permanent feature of your personality. It's a fragile construction that depends on circumstances you take for granted. Climate scientists warn us about increasing weather instability. Social scientists document the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and psychotic disorders in modern populations. The infrastructure that protects your mental health is more fragile than you realize. When it fails, when the power goes out permanently, when the social support systems collapse, you'll understand why I'm teaching you these lessons now, but we're still not finished. There's one more war I need to show you. One more battlefield where these people fought for something that might generously be called survival. Next time, I'll tell you about the war for the soul itself. The bargains they made with forces that should never be awakened, the prices they paid for survival that made death seem like mercy, and you'll learn why some knowledge should stay buried with the bones of those who possessed it. You've come this far. You've seen the wars for food, for heat, for space, for sanity. You've watched comfortable human beings transform into something unrecognizable, something that barely qualifies as human at all, but you haven't seen the worst yet. Tonight, I'm going to show you what happens when people exhaust every natural resource, every physical strategy, every psychological adaptation. Tonight, we're going to talk about what they did when the only thing left to sacrifice was their souls. You live in a world that has forgotten the reality of desperate faith. Your gods are comfortable abstractions. Your prayers are polite requests. Your rituals are social performances. You've never needed to actually trade pieces of your humanity for survival. You've never had to negotiate directly with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of what your rational mind can accept. You've never been so desperate that damnation seemed like a reasonable price to pay for seeing another sunrise. But in our Norse longhouse, when the food was gone, when the heat was failing, when madness had claimed half the community and death was circling like a patient predator, they turned to the old ways. The ways that predated Christianity, predated civilization, predated the comfortable illusion that humans are the masters of their own destiny. They turned to practices that would make your modern sensibilities recoil in absolute horror. Archaeological excavations have uncovered ritual spaces in longhouse ruins that contain evidence of practices so disturbing that academic papers describing them are often classified or restricted, altars constructed from human bones, arranged in patterns that seem to follow no known religious tradition. Bloodstains that chemical analysis confirms came from multiple individuals, applied in layers over extended periods, carved symbols that appear nowhere else in the archaeological record, as if they were created specifically for purposes too dark to be recorded elsewhere. The winter solstice was when the darkest bargains were made. On the longest night, when hope had been exhausted and death seemed inevitable, community leaders would perform rituals designed to contact what they called the hunger that walks. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They believed they were making actual contact with entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death, entities that might be willing to trade survival for payment in human suffering. Historical records describe preparation rituals that lasted for days, fasting that pushed participants to the edge of death, sleep deprivation that induced altered states of consciousness, consumption of psychoactive substances that opened doorways in the mind that should never be opened. The participants weren't trying to commune with benevolent gods or ancestral spirits. They were deliberately seeking contact with entities that fed on pain, desperation, and degradation. The central ritual involved what Norse texts refer to as the willing gift of self. But this wasn't the noble self-sacrifice you might imagine. Archaeological evidence suggests it involved the systematic torture and mutilation of volunteers who had been selected through processes that remain unclear. Cut marks on bones suggest prolonged periods of suffering, evidence of restraint systems designed to keep victims alive and conscious during extended torture, signs of ritual cannibalism performed while the victims were still breathing. But here's the truly disturbing part. These weren't unwilling victims. The archaeological evidence, combined with fragmentary historical accounts, suggests that people volunteered for these rituals. They competed for the right to be tortured to death in service of community survival, because the alternative, watching everyone they loved die slowly from cold and starvation, was somehow worse than becoming a living sacrifice to entities that existed beyond human comprehension. The psychological conditioning required to make this seem reasonable tells you everything you need to know about the state of these communities. Months of gradual dehumanization, of watching moral boundaries dissolve one by one, of adapting to increasingly horrific circumstances, had created populations that could no longer distinguish between salvation and damnation. They had been broken so thoroughly that volunteering for ritual torture seemed like an act of love. Children were particularly prized for these rituals, not because of any inherent evil in the communities, but because of the terrible practical logic of their situation. Adults represented accumulated knowledge, skills, and strength that might be needed for reconstruction after winter. Children represented potential future, but only if there was enough food to keep them alive until spring. In the brutal mathematics of winter survival, sacrificing a child to entities that might provide salvation for adults made sense in ways that would shatter your modern conscience. The rituals themselves defied rational description. Fragmentary accounts describe practices that seem to combine elements of torture, religious ceremony, and psychological manipulation in ways designed to break down the barriers between physical and spiritual reality. Participants reported visions of entities that promised relief from suffering in exchange for increasingly horrific offerings, voices that spoke in languages no human throat could produce, demanding prices that grew higher with each negotiation. Archaeological evidence suggests that these rituals sometimes worked, at least from the perspective of the participants. Longhouses with evidence of extensive ritual activity show higher survival rates than those without such evidence. Food caches appear that can't be explained by normal hunting or gathering activities. Bodies of strangers found in the vicinity suggesting that somehow these isolated communities were attracting travelers who could be killed and consumed. Of course, modern analysis suggests rational explanation. The psychological effects of the rituals might have increased community cohesion, making survival more likely. The altered states of consciousness might have enhanced problem-solving abilities, leading to better resource management. The willingness to engage in extreme violence might have made these communities more effective at raiding neighboring settlements for supplies, but the participants didn't believe in rational explanations. They believed they had made contact with forces beyond human understanding, forces that had accepted their offerings and provided salvation in return, and the price they paid for that salvation marked them permanently in ways that went far beyond physical scarring. Survivors of these rituals displayed behavioral changes that persisted long after winter ended. Archaeological evidence shows elevated rates of self-mutilation, suggesting that participants became addicted to the pain that had been their offering to the entities they contacted. Ritual spaces continued to be used even when food was abundant and survival was no longer in question, suggesting that the practice had become compulsive rather than practical. More disturbing still, the children who survived these communities grew up with completely altered concepts of religious practice and moral behavior. Archaeological excavations of second-generation settlements show evidence of ritual violence that had no survival justification whatsoever. The practices had evolved from desperate survival strategies into cultural traditions that were passed down through generations. The psychological trauma created bloodlines of individuals who could no longer function in normal social circumstances. They had been conditioned to expect that love required suffering, that survival demanded sacrifice, that contact with the divine involved torture and mutilation. They built societies that institutionalized these expectations, creating cultures where ritual violence was not an aberration, but a fundamental requirement for spiritual and social health. Historical accounts describe entire communities that became dependent on ritual violence for psychological stability. Spring would arrive, resources would become available, but the community would continue to perform increasingly elaborate sacrifice rituals. The entities they believed they had contacted during their desperate winter had become permanent residents in their psychological landscape, demanding regular feeding to maintain their protection. Some of these communities developed into what historical records describe as blood cults that persisted for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows ritual sites that were used continuously for generations, with evidence of increasingly sophisticated torture techniques and more elaborate sacrifice ceremonies. What had begun as desperate survival strategy had evolved into religious tradition that influenced entire cultural regions. The most disturbing aspect of these practices wasn't their brutality, it was their effectiveness, at least from the perspective of community survival. Archaeological evidence shows that communities that engaged in ritual violence showed higher long-term survival rates, more successful expansion into new territories, and greater resistance to external threats. The psychological conditioning that enabled ritual torture also created warriors, who were essentially immune to normal psychological warfare, traders who could negotiate from positions of absolute moral flexibility, and leaders who could make decisions without being constrained by conventional ethical considerations. And here's the truth that should keep you awake at night. These practices didn't disappear with the medieval period. Archaeological evidence shows similar ritual sites in North America, Siberia, and other regions where indigenous populations faced similar survival challenges. The psychological mechanisms that enable ritual violence as a survival strategy are part of human nature, dormant in comfortable circumstances, but available for activation when desperation reaches sufficient levels. Modern studies of extreme survival situations show similar patterns of moral degradation and ritual violence. Concentration camp survivors describe the development of elaborate ritual practices designed to maintain psychological stability under impossible circumstances. Survivors of natural disasters report engaging in behaviors that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The capacity for ritual violence isn't a historical curiosity. It's a survival mechanism that exists in every human being, waiting for the right circumstances to activate it. Climate scientists predict increasing frequency of extreme weather events. Social scientists document rising rates of social isolation and community breakdown. Economic analysts warn of potential supply chain failures and infrastructure collapse. The comfortable illusions that protect your moral sensibilities are more fragile than you realize. When they fail, when desperation reaches the levels our ancestors faced, you'll discover the same dark flexibility that enabled their survival. But there's one more truth I need to share with you, one final revelation that brings this entire nightmare full circle. The worst part isn't what these people did to survive winter. The worst part is what winter did to the people who survived it. And next time, I'll show you why sometimes death is the kindest thing that winter can offer. You'll learn why those who made it to spring often spent the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. So here we are, the final act of our frozen horror story. You've stayed with me through the cannibal mathematics of food rationing, the flesh furnaces of heat generation, the brutal geography of spatial warfare, and the mind-shattering darkness that devoured sanity like a living thing. You've seen human beings reduced to their most primal elements, transformed by desperation into creatures that barely qualify as human anymore. But the real horror isn't what these people became during their months in hell. It's what they remained after hell finally released them. Spring always came, eventually. The snow would melt, the sun would stay up longer, the frozen ground would soften enough to bury the accumulated dead. Food would become available again. The desperate calculations of winter survival would be replaced by the relative abundance of growing seasons. The longhouse doors would open, and the survivors would stumble out into a world that seemed impossible after months of suffocating darkness and crushing desperation. But they didn't emerge as the same people who had entered winter. They emerged as something else entirely. Something that had been forged in circumstances so extreme that they had transcended normal human limitations and become living embodiments of survival itself. And that transformation was permanent, irreversible, and absolutely terrifying. Archaeological evidence shows that post-winter communities exhibited behavioral patterns that persisted for generations, hoarding behaviors that continued even when resources were abundant, violent responses to perceived resource competition even when no actual scarcity existed, ritualistic practices that had no survival value but continued to be performed with religious intensity. These weren't temporary adaptations that faded when circumstances improved. These were permanent rewiring of human psychology. The survivors couldn't trust abundance. After months of calculating every calorie, every degree of warmth, every inch of space, they were psychologically incapable of believing that scarcity wouldn't return. Archaeological excavations show evidence of elaborate hidden food caches, secret storage areas, and redundant supply systems that went far beyond reasonable preparation for future winters. These people had become addicted to survival preparation, unable to enjoy present abundance because they were constantly preparing for future disaster. More disturbing still, they couldn't trust other human beings. The bonds of family, friendship, and community that had been systematically destroyed during winter never fully reformed. Archaeological evidence shows elevated rates of interpersonal violence in post-winter communities. Domestic abuse, child abandonment, elderly neglect. The survival strategies that had kept them alive had also destroyed their capacity for normal human relationships. The children who survived were the most damaged of all. They had learned that love meant making impossible choices, that family meant competing for resources, that survival meant being willing to sacrifice anyone for any reason. Archaeological excavations show evidence of child abuse rates that are staggering even by medieval standards. Broken bones, evidence of restraint and confinement, signs of systematic nutritional deprivation even when food was available. But the abuse wasn't motivated by cruelty. It was motivated by the parents' desperate need to prepare their children for future winters. They believed that soft, comfortable children would die when the cold returned, so they deliberately traumatized them during good times to build the psychological resilience needed for survival. Love had been redefined as the willingness to inflict suffering to prevent greater suffering later. Sexual relationships became transactional in ways that persisted long after survival necessity had passed. Archaeological evidence suggests elevated rates of sexual violence and reproductive coercion in post-winter communities, not because the survivors were inherently evil, but because they had learned to view human bodies as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected. The intimate bonds that make sexual relationships meaningful had been destroyed by months of viewing other humans as potential food, fuel, or competition. Marriage contracts from surviving documents show provisions for resource allocation during lean times that are essentially prenuptial agreements for cannibalism, explicit clauses about which partner would be sacrificed if survival required it, detailed arrangements for the distribution of a deceased spouse's body among surviving family members. Love had been reduced to a survival strategy with clearly defined terms and conditions. The religious implications were equally disturbing. Communities that had engaged in ritual violence during winter survival continued those practices even when they were no longer necessary. Archaeological evidence shows ritual sites that were used for decades after the survival crisis had passed, with increasingly elaborate ceremonies that served no practical purpose except to maintain contact with the entities they believed had saved them. These weren't isolated incidents. Pattern analysis of archaeological sites across Scandinavia shows that communities that survived extreme winters consistently developed religious practices centered around ritual violence, human sacrifice, and communion with dark entities. The desperate bargains made during survival crises became the foundation for entire religious movements that influenced cultural development for centuries. The survivors couldn't return to their pre-winter religious beliefs. Christianity, with its emphasis on mercy, forgiveness, and protection of the weak, made no sense to people who had learned that mercy was deadly, forgiveness was wasteful, and the weak existed to be consumed by the strong. They developed syncretic belief systems that combined Christian imagery with practices that would have horrified the early church fathers. Archaeological evidence shows churches built over ritual sites where human sacrifice had been performed. Christian symbols carved directly into altars that were still stained with human blood. Religious artwork that depicted Christ and the apostles engaged in acts of ritual violence and cannibalism. These weren't corruptions of Christianity. They were sincere attempts to reconcile Christian teachings with the reality of what survival had required them to become. But the most disturbing transformation was in their concept of time itself. Normal human beings live in the present, plan for the future, remember the past. The winter survivors lived in a permanent state of crisis preparation. They couldn't experience present moment abundance because they were constantly calculating for future scarcity. They couldn't make long-term plans because they had learned that circumstances could change instantly and catastrophically. They couldn't remember the past without reliving the trauma of their survival choices. This created communities that were simultaneously incredibly resilient and completely dysfunctional. They could survive disasters that would destroy normal populations, but they couldn't maintain stable social relationships or develop sustainable economic systems. They were perfectly adapted for crisis, but completely maladapted for peace. Archaeological evidence shows that many post-winter communities eventually collapsed, not from external threats or resource scarcity, but from internal dysfunction. The psychological damage from winter survival created social systems that were inherently unstable, violence rates that made normal community life impossible, reproductive patterns that couldn't sustain population growth, economic systems based on hoarding and exploitation rather than cooperation and development. The survivors often lived for decades after their winter ordeals, but they never really escaped them. Archaeological analysis of stress markers and skeletal remains shows that winter survivors exhibited chronic physiological stress responses, even during periods of abundance and security. Their bodies remained in constant survival mode, pumping stress hormones, maintaining heightened alert states, burning through resources at unsustainable rates, even when resources were plentiful. Many died young despite surviving the winter that should have killed them, not from violence or disease, but from the simple physiological exhaustion of maintaining crisis responses for years after the crisis had passed. Their bodies, minds, and souls had been so thoroughly rewired for survival that they couldn't adapt to the less demanding circumstances of normal life. And here's the final truth, the one that brings this entire nightmare full circle. Those genetic lines, those bloodlines that carried the psychological and physiological adaptations for extreme survival, they didn't disappear. They're still here. They're in the DNA of modern Scandinavians. And through Viking expansion and migration patterns, they're in your DNA too. The capacity for the choices they made, the strategies they developed, the transformations they underwent, it's all still there, dormant in your genetic code, waiting for the right circumstances to activate it. Climate scientists predict increasing frequency of extreme weather events. Social scientists document rising rates of community breakdown and resource competition. Economic analysts warn of potential infrastructure collapse and supply chain failures. When those predictions become reality, when the comfortable systems that maintain your civilized behavior fail, when you find yourself facing the same impossible choices that our ancestors faced, you'll discover that you carry their solutions in your blood. You'll find yourself capable of the same calculations, the same violence, the same bargains, with forces that exist beyond the boundaries of rational thought. You'll look at your own children and calculate their caloric value. You'll feel the weight of another human body and consider whether they would burn longer than the firewood you don't have. You'll find yourself participating in rituals that your civilized mind can't even imagine, making offerings to entities that your rational thought insists can't exist. And the most terrifying realization of all will be how natural it feels. How easily you slip into patterns that were carved into your genetic code by generations of ancestors who faced the same choices. How quickly your modern moral framework dissolves when survival depends on abandoning it. How readily you become the very monster that you've been listening to me describe. Because that's the real lesson of Norse winter survival. It's not a historical curiosity about primitive people living in harsh conditions. It's a preview of your own potential transformation. A glimpse into the creature you become when civilization fails and survival demands that you transcend the comfortable limitations of human morality. The next time you adjust your thermostat, remember the sound of Olaf's fingers hitting the longhouse floor. The next time you open your refrigerator, remember the taste of choices that would shatter your soul. The next time you flip a light switch, remember the darkness that lives inside your own mind, waiting for the right circumstances to consume everything you think you are. And remember this, winter always comes back. Climate patterns are cyclical, resource abundance is temporary, the infrastructure that maintains your comfortable delusions is more fragile than you want to believe. When it fails, when the cold returns, when desperation reaches the levels that our ancestors knew, you'll understand why I spent these long nights teaching you these lessons. Because when that time comes, and it will come, you'll need to know what you're capable of becoming. You'll need to understand the choices that await you. You'll need to recognize the voice of survival when it whispers in your ear and tells you to pick up the knife, to draw the lots, to make the offerings that will carry you through to spring. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge will help you retain some small fragment of your humanity while you do what survival demands. Or maybe it will just help you understand why, sometimes, the kindest thing winter can offer is a quick death in the snow,